Assalamu alaikum and welcome to The World This Week with me, Anas Al-Tikriti. The authorities in Burma have waged a campaign of ethnic cleansing against its Rohingya Muslim population. That's according to a new report released by Human Rights Watch this week. The report came on the same day that the European Union announced it would lift all remaining sanctions against the Southeast Asian country. So has the EU moved too soon? And in part two, 10 years after the war in Darfur, are peace and stability finally on the horizon in Sudan? But first, to Burma, where democratic reforms have been marred by what appear to be systematic attacks against Muslims. Let's take a look at this report.
A group of men set upon a Muslim in a field and beat and hack him to death with sticks and knives. This footage shows police officers standing by as Buddhists destroy properties and actively attack and murder Muslims in the Burmese town of Megtila. This is why many have been outraged by the decision by the EU on Monday to lift sanctions on Burma in response to the burgeoning democracy supposedly blossoming in the country.
Today we closed a very long chapter in our relations with Myanmar-Burma by lifting the political and economic sanctions. Only the arms embargo remains in place. We know that much remains to be done on human rights, on democracy, fighting poverty and achieving lasting peace. We don't underestimate the challenges.
Many have criticised the move as premature in light of the ethno-religious violence that has been meted out against Muslims in the country in the past year. A report by Human Rights Watch has concluded that the Burmese government is guilty of ethnic cleansing.
Despite very clear warning signs of imminent and serious violence, and despite humanitarian and human rights implications of what was happening, the government authorities did nothing to intervene to stop it. Not only did they fail to intervene, but government security forces and authorities destroyed mosques, effectively blocked humanitarian aid to Rohingya populations, and at times acted alongside Arakanese to forcibly displace Muslims. And again, this was the period of time before the wave of violence in October.
Much of the impetus for the violence has stemmed from the Buddhist nationalist movement 969. Many commentators have referred to the group as Buddhist neo-Nazis for their extreme, brutal anti-Muslim rhetoric. Their leader, the Buddhist monk Wirathu, has referred to himself as the Burmese bin Laden and has spoken frequently of the need to drive out what he sees as immigrant Muslims from Burma, saying in one speech, "We must do business or otherwise interact with only our kind, same race and same faith." In spite of the new evidence, Burma's President Thein Sein has been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize, a move which has angered some campaigners who see this as overlooking the continuing anti-Muslim pogroms in the country. This morning, the President released 93 political prisoners, which could be taken as a move on his part to show a greater commitment to plurality in Burma. But with the ethno-religious violence seemingly spiralling out of control and evidence of government involvement damning, are we really seeing a new age of freedom and openness in the country, or are the changes just cosmetic? Alex MacDonald, Islam Channel.
So, is the EU right to encourage democratic reform in Burma, or is it giving out all the wrong messages to a state that stands accused of ethnic cleansing? With me to discuss these issues is Assed Baig, a journalist who has just returned from Burma, and Waihnin Pwint Thon from Burma Campaign UK, and on the phone we have Justin Wintle, a biographer of Aung San Suu Kyi, who has been outspoken against sanctions on Burma. Welcome to you all and thank you very much for joining us. Let me start with you, Assed. You've recently just returned from Burma, having spent 2 weeks over there. Give us an overview of what you saw.
The report covered two issues. One is the continued persecution and oppression of the Rohingya Muslims in Arakan, and also the recent violence against Burmese Muslims in the central Myanmar town of Megtila and other places as well. And I'll start with the second, Megtila first, because that's what's happened recently. Now, what I saw was, when I went to Megtila, was mosques destroyed, houses destroyed, but not only that, the Buddhists had put Buddhist national flags over the mosques and over the burnt properties. I interviewed eyewitnesses who said that their family members were killed in front of their eyes. Some of them even said that they were burnt alive. I took a number of interviews that they said that they were burnt alive. And they said that the police did nothing. And in one case, women and children are only let go after the police agreed with the Buddhist monks that the women would worship the Buddhist monks, and then they were let go. Then to the Rohingya population, they're still being oppressed. They're still in IDP camps. Still under curfew, no aid is getting through, or very limited aid, and they're not considered as Burmese citizens, so they effectively have no rights.
Justin Wintle on the phone, thank you very much for joining us. And you've been a long-term campaigner against sanctions on Burma, and that's quite understandable and quite admirable. I myself worked on lifting sanction campaigns on various countries like Iraq and during the 90s and the such, and I understand the implications of sanctions. But do you not see that the EU coming to a decision to lift the sanctions against Burma at a time when these wave of attacks are taking place sends the wrong kind of messages?
Well, to a degree, yes. I wouldn't describe myself as a campaigner, by the way. I'm a commenter, historian, what have you, so I observe. And my feeling was that while sanctions were worth trying in the 1990s, by isolating Burma, they were really damaging the mass of Burmese people. The disturbances over the last year, both in Rakhine State against the Rohingya population there and in Mektila, dreadful scenes, and I would never condone things like that. My gut feeling is, and these are hard calls, and I don't dispute that, my gut feeling is that the more Burma Myanmar, as it should be called these days, is reeled into the quote-unquote international community, the more our values are going to rub off on them. And there's a very good example of this. President Thein Sein last year was saying that the Rohingyas were unwelcome in Myanmar and they should leave. He's recently changed his tune and he's conceded that they should be given citizen rights, at least those who have been there for several generations.
But is that move, is that in response to these attacks coming to the attention of a worldwide audience, or is it because of internal pressures? Why this backtrack, as you put it?
Well, I think it is very much to do with his having to work with Western governments and so forth, and going around the world and meeting some foreign leaders. I would have to say that if sanctions were reimposed, and by the way, the arms embargo remains in place, so not all sanctions have been scrapped, but if full sanctions were to be reapplied and the country were to be isolated again, I think there would be a horrendous bloodbath.
Waihnin, you've heard Assed, who's just come back from Burma, and we've also heard Justin just a few seconds ago. What's your take? I mean, this is your country, and I'd like to hear what you think about what this is exactly. I mean, is this a religious infight? Is this a civil war? Is this about race and ethnicity? What is this about?
Well, if we look at the religious persecution against Muslim in the country, I would say there are lots of, prejudice against Muslim in the country. And if we talk about sanctions, EU lift all the sanctions, I feel that it's abandoning people in Burma who are in need of help. I mean, of course, they leave, arms embargo. But the question is, why do they leave arms embargo if Burma is free of ethnic persecutions and ethnic cleansing? So that's remained a big question.
If the sanctions were to remain, would these attacks be prevented in any way?
EU had a benchmark last year that all political prisoners should be freed, and their, a benchmark on ethnic conflicts and Rohingya issues. Nothing have been solved. I think it's too early to do that. And also people are talking and promoting things saying to get a Nobel Peace Prize. I think it's appalling. I mean, he and his government stood there, did nothing when Muslims were killed. And Rohingya, he was talking about expelling those Rohingya Muslim minority from the country. And that kind of person should not get a Nobel Peace Prize. And I think it is an appalling act from EU to lift all the sanctions. And people should be asking why they leave arms embargo in place if Burma is a free or a peaceful country, as they would say.
Assed, I'm going to ask you the same question. I mean, from what you saw, and obviously you've been following the story way before you actually went to Burma, how would you describe the conflict? I mean, is it ethnic? Is it about Muslims?
I don't want to call it a
Burmese nationalism. And we've heard in the report about the self-proclaimed Burmese Bin Laden, for instance. I mean, is this something which is known widely to the Burmese population? Do they condone this?
The thing is, look, I don't want to call it a conflict. A conflict is between two equal sides, as I see it, or at least relatively equal sides. What happened in Metila, what is happening in Arakan, what is happening to the Rohingya is not between two equal sides. It's a massacre. There's no other way of describing it. And I know the guy on the phone just said, you know, our values will rub off on this.
Yeah.
Justin, sorry. And I'm sorry, they won't. The signal that is being given to the Burmese government is this: you've just massacred, your people have just massacred Muslims. You've got Rohingya Muslims that you call Bengali, that you don't recognize as citizens, got them in IDP camps under curfew, and we're going to lift the sanctions. We think that's okay. That's the message it sends. And this anti-Muslim hatred and Islamophobia that's been spread by Wirathu and 969 is mainstream in Burma.
It's not margin. It's not on the peripheries of society.
I interviewed a Buddhist monk, and he said to me, Muslims causing problems everywhere, we don't want them here. I said, what do you think about Wirathu? He said, I like him, he is good. I said, don't you think his speeches are problematic? Because they could be seen that way, but no. I asked him about Aung San Suu Kyi. Will she recognize the rights of the Rohingya? He said, never. I support her, we support her. He said, we support her. She will never recognize them.
Okay, just so that I'm more clear on this. When the monk that you've just mentioned here, when he says that the Muslims create a lot of problems, what kind of problems is he alluding to?
He said, this is exactly what he said. He said, they have 4 wives, they have loads of children, they're trying to outbreed us, and they will try and take over. He then continued to say, if you look around the world, it is the Muslims that are causing the problems. And if Muslim countries feel so much for the Muslims here, why don't they take them?
So it's essentially a nationalistic issue that has now reached the peripheries, if according to that language, of racism and the kind of language that we saw in South Africa. And
I think it's sometimes worse. I think that we are verging on fascism from what I heard. And it's not only me, another journalist with me, we interviewed monks. And this racist language, this kind of dehumanization of Muslims is just mainstream.
Okay, Justin, this is not about a disturbance, it's not a conflict, this is an all-out massacre. It's not, you know, the Burmese Bin Laden is not by any means, as I imagined before the show, on the peripheries of the mainstream. He is, and his supporters are mainstream. What's your take on that? And also I'd like to ask you about the position of Aung San Suu Kyi, because you're her biographer, you know about her more than most. Many have been waiting for her to speak on this. So if you'd like to comment on these 2 points.
Yeah, sure. I'll deal with Aung San Suu Kyi first, who, by the way, has voiced her support for the final scrapping of those sanctions, which were actually suspended a year ago. I think it is a racist thing, and it's very deep-seated. I mean, I've met so many Burmese Buddhists who talk about loving kindness and tolerance, metta and all that stuff. And you mentioned the Rohingyas. Oh, throw them in the sea, they say. It's a very deep-seated problem there. And it's very awful. Aung San Suu Kyi has expressed her sympathy for the sufferings of the Muslim people, but she won't go that stage further to insist that they are given protection and full rights.
Why not?
Because it's a little bit of a puzzle, because she's become an icon of human rights, but she's lost street cred over this internationally. I think it is because she's high Burma. She is virtually Burma's aristocracy, and her father, whom she greatly admires, the founder of modern Burma, who was assassinated just before Burmese independence. There was a nasty episode during the war where he actually killed a Muslim in cold blood and then threw him in a pig cart. And it runs so deep. I do feel, and as I said, these are hard calls to make, but I do feel that the way that attitudes within Burma can be changed is integration with the rest of the world and not isolation, because, as I say, your commentator just now quite rightly said it's a massacre. It's a massacre which could get much worse and could lead to total ethnic cleansing.
So how? But how could we? I mean, how could we wed this with the the celebration of lifting all sanctions? I mean, what recourse does the world have now on Burma and the Burmese decision policymakers if now sanctions have been lifted and basically there is no recourse and the government now is watching as a massacre is unfolding on its own lands? I mean, how can we celebrate the lifting of sanctions at this particular moment of time?
Well, I don't think it's quite. I mean, I haven't seen people out on the streets crying with joy at this business of the sanctions. I'm afraid it's going to be a very long process. Soft power, basically, it's about the more and more people inside Burma relate to us, whether it's in business, diplomacy, what have you, and to try and force them to change their own values. And I don't say it's guaranteed at all, and I think it's a very deep-seated problem, and it's tragic.
Waihnin, I mean, the scenes that we saw, what we've heard from Assed, what we've heard from Justin, I mean, they really they speak of a different time, of a different place, of something that most of us can't even begin to imagine. I mean, when we talk about sanctions, I mean, what comes to my mind, for instance, is South Africa. The apartheid South Africa, where the world collaborated to bring sanctions against that regime and therefore force it to change, basically, into a modern or quasi-modern state. Would that be the kind of approach that you would assume, that you would campaign for? That no, actually, rather than remove sanctions, you need to tighten sanctions. But also, you have to think about the human cost of this. I mean, because obviously it'll be, women and children and the poor who will suffer as a result. So, I mean, what's your strategy on this? I mean, from what you've heard, what do you think the future holds, and what would be your strategy for coming to some sort of resolution?
When we talk about sanctions, lots of people, like Justin, might like to argue that, because of sanctions, we've been isolated for many years and our country's been poorer and poorer. But now if we have, the sanctions been lifted and all the investment will go in, they will do business with rich people, and richer, rich people will get richer, and poor people is cheap labour. Yeah. For the international investment, and they don't gain anything. And then also, we talk about humanitarian access and humanitarian assistance. When there was sanctions, those were not under sanctions. Different country can go in and support for a humanitarian, and that's the government who block all the humanitarian aid to Rohingya or other refugees in ITB camps. That's the government is stopping people from getting a freedom or anything. And when Thein Sein became a government, he talked about economic solution. He want Burma to become richer and people to get more income so that they will stop talking about democracy. And he said, they will stop following the distractions, which means democracy movement. So would you, for me, I don't want my country to have a 20% of freedom with lots of problems in the country. There are lots of, anti-Muslim things going on, and no one's been arrested. I mean, this Wirathu guy, monk, keep going. Different city, different towns, preaching about anti-Muslim thing. And they don't recognize Muslim as human being. They even compare to us as dogs. They said, those Muslims are not humans, they are just dogs.
Tell me about your own campaign, Burma UK. Who do you meet with? I mean, what do you tell them? Do you meet with British government officials? Do you meet with policymakers, think tanks? What do you tell them? What is the way out of this? So,
for example, yesterday, and there were political prisoners were released. Our campaign, we meet with British government and we meet with government official. If we have a lobbying trip to different countries, especially to EU, we talk about it. So I think sometimes people get carried away. And those, Rohingya report came out on Monday, and also there was a BBC report on how Muslims being killed in Maitila. And not much people were talking about it. EU lifted sanctions, and yesterday 59 political prisoners were released and they were praising about it. UK Foreign Minister was like, oh, it is a good step that political prisoners have been released. No one's been talking about what is actually still going on in Burma.
I'm guessing that Burma, Assed, is a sort of a success story in the eyes of many, and therefore they don't want to go back on that and taint it with any kind of ill stories such as the ones that we've seen on screen.
That's pretty much right, I think. And also we have to remember that Burma has a lot of natural resources. There's a gas pipeline being built all the way to China. And just off the shore of Sitways in Arakan, where the Rohingya are based, is a offshore gas station, 51% owned by Daewoo. There's a lot of money to be made in Burma.
Tell me this. You're now back in the UK. What do you? I mean, my question is. What do you tell your constituents, your readers, the people who will listen to you? What do you tell them? Do you tell them this is essentially a Buddhist-Muslim conflict? Do you tell them this is about human rights? Do you tell them, what do you tell them
I tell
exactly?
them the facts. I tell, for example, when I went to the Rohingya areas, I came out with an exclusive where we discovered eyewitness accounts that Rohingya women were being kept and possibly raped at military camps. So I only deal with facts, I don't deal with speculation. So when I interviewed people for Metila, I asked them what happened. I said, are you an eyewitness? Did you see this? And only people that saw stuff with their own eyes. This isn't, you know, this is institutional in Burma. If you're a Muslim, Burmese Muslim, you will not be considered ethnically Burmese. You are on your ID card, you say they're Tamil, Indian, Bengali, they don't recognize you. So this is inherent institutional racism that's taking place.
We've seen the reluctance of the political circles in the UK to sort of address this head on. But we're finding British media, mainstream media, they're quite, you know, they're quite open to relating these stories. Are you finding the same?
No, I think, look, the BBC published 2.5 weeks, maybe 3 weeks after I had gone out. We contacted media. My trip was entirely funded by the public. People said, we want the issue of Burma covered. We asked the public to donate. People donated, so I went out as a freelance journalist. And our stories, alhamdulillah, they got out. You know, we've had tens of thousands of people reading our articles, but the mainstream media was slow to pick up on it. A number of reasons. One, because the journalists are based in Bangkok. Two, when they do come to Rangoon or Yangon, they stay in hotels and they rarely go out and want to speak to people on the ground. And three, I think, is also very difficult for them. Right. If you speak to a foreign journalist, your life could be at risk.
Justin, just one final thing. We have about a minute to go before we break. How do you see the way out of this? I mean, what would your address be to the people who are watching this program, listening to you, and asking questions about why it is that despite the world all coming together to support Aung San Suu Kyi during her many years of house arrest and you know, the fight for democracy, that many people who don't really know much about Burma, you know, but still they fought the fight for democracy there. What would you tell them now? Are they right to feel utterly disappointed, totally let down? Should they feel hopeful or hopeless? You've said that you think that things are going to get worse before they ever get better. What would you say to the listeners or the audience today?
Well, I didn't necessarily say they were going to get worse, but it'll be a long time before they get better. I think the persecution of the Rohingyas has been going on for decades and decades. It's really only now that Burma has opened up somewhat that we're getting much more reporting on that. And for all their woes at the moment, that is good for the Rohingya people and other Muslims in Burma, I think. Beyond that, I think that pressure has to be put on Aung San Suu Kyi to really make her mark in this debate in a favourable way. And that is probably... and she will change. I mean, there was a thing when she decided not to take her seat when she was in a by-election. She won a seat in the National Assembly.
Justin, I'll have to cut you short, but really I appreciate those last remarks of yours. Justin on the phone, Assed Baig and Waihnin in the studio. I'd like to thank you all for talking about this particular issue. I'm sure that we'll come back to it. But now we have to go to a break, so stay tuned. When we come back, we'll be talking about Sudan and Darfur. Thank you.